Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome to our lecture on documentaries. So this is a longer video than normal, so feel free to use timecodes in the description to skip around, replay certain sections, go nuts. So I'm guessing that the word documentary conjures up a very specific image for many of you. School! So you've probably enjoyed watching a video in a science or social studies class at one point in your childhoods. I always looked forward to watching Bill Nye the Science Guy in science class growing up, not just because I loved his science knowledge, but because this dude knows how to market himself. I mean, look at that crazy rhyme, Bill Nye the Science Guy. If you think I came up with Dr. Dan the Movie Man without carefully consulting this example, you would be wrong. In addition to watching documentaries at school, you may have watched one or two documentaries on TV channels like the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, PBS, or A&E, where people like Ken Burns and Lynn Novick get to make really, really, really long, multi-part documentaries about American history. Like Prohibition, which at 3 hours and 3 episodes and 5.5 hours basically qualifies as a short film for these two. Normally, they go for longer stuff like the national parks at 6 episodes and 12 hours, or probably their best work, the Vietnam War, which is 10 episodes and 17.25 hours covering the entire history of that conflict. If you're missing sports, check out baseball. 9 episodes because there's 9 innings, get it? 18 and a half hours, it's really going to put you in a spring training mood. Or maybe you've recently watched one of the 9 million documentaries on Netflix, like Tiger King, which Grizzly Man is sometimes compared to. These are a lot of fun, these documentaries. I bet many of you really have enjoyed going through the Netflix catalog over the last few weeks. But here's the thing about these documentaries. This is only a small fraction of what's out there. If you limit yourself to documentaries that you see in school or on TV or on Netflix, you'll be missing out on films like Orson Welles' F for Fake or Al Reinert's For All Mankind, which are taking subjects that on the surface could be very dry, like art forgery in Orson Welles' film, or the space program in the case of Al Reinert's film, and use them as the basis for a very poetic exploration into what film can do as a medium, first and foremost, and then their ostensible subject second. You would also be missing out on films like The Fog of War or Crumb, which take a really in-depth look at the kinds of people you're not necessarily going to be meeting on a day-to-day basis, like former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara or the artist R. Crumb. And it dives into their personalities, their histories, and by the time the film is done, you feel as if you have come to know these people. Which again, for most of us, you're not going to have that experience. Although interestingly, my neighbor in Iowa City, her husband is a big record collector, and apparently he hangs out with the subject of the second film on a pretty regular basis. But that's the exception that proves the rule. You would also be missing out on films like the subject of this week's lecture, Werner Herzog's Grizzly Man, which again, Tiger King has frequently been compared to in the last few weeks as people are watching that movie. But the thing about looking at a film like Grizzly Man in that context is you really start to realize how the same subject matter, the strange people who want to go hang out with dangerous animals, can produce two completely different films. And so, my goal in this lecture today is to talk through some of the things that Grizzly Man is doing that are really, really interesting. and then use that as an entry point to expose you to a small fraction of the vast variety of documentaries out there that I think you should see at some point. So before we get started, we should lay down a few key points. My operating baseline assumption whenever I talk about documentaries, whenever I watch a documentary, is that these movies are never, ever reproducing the world. They are representing it. What does that mean? Well, this means that documentaries never show you everything that is really happening. Film is not reality. It's an artistic medium, and so it's impossible for any film to truly show you the entire picture, to tell you the entire story, to give you unmediated access to raw reality. It's impossible for any film, documentary or fiction, to be totally 100% objective. Filmmakers in this mode are not simply giving you raw reality, they are making an argument about the world. They are telling stories about the world. Now, this doesn't mean that you should assume that documentaries are faking it. Even though some filmmakers have released fake documentaries and sprung them on suspecting, or in some cases, unsuspecting viewers. This is Spinal Tap is arguably the most famous mockumentary about this terrible rock band that never actually existed, but are being portrayed by actors like Christopher Guest and Harry Shearer. But the joke of the film is this is following them around on world tour, and we get to laugh at them, and the joke that it might be happening, or the idea of treating it like it is happening, makes it funny. Forgotten Silver is an early film by Peter Jackson, who later became known as the director of The Lord of the Rings, and the gag in that film was there was this New Zealand silent filmmaker that nobody had ever heard about until Peter Jackson uncovered stories about this guy and found old films in the archive. But here's the thing. It was all a lie. It was all bullshit. It was totally an invention of Peter Jackson and his collaborators. But here's the thing. They didn't tell anybody about that until a couple of months after its release. And that was the joke. It was very much a joke on the audience, whereas This Is Spinal Tap was a joke with the audience. But both of these are using the premise that documentary isn't always as truthful as it sometimes seems to be the basis for comedy. But these are the exceptions that prove the rule. Most documentaries are not trying to give you a fake reality. Most of the time, they are going after unscripted encounters with the real world. So when we talk about documentary representation, we're really talking about a whole host of choices, decisions that filmmakers have to make about how they are going to present a selective view of reality. For example, do you use voiceover narration? Do you ask Morgan Freeman to narrate the thoughts and feelings of penguins in Antarctica? Or do you present beautiful images of nature without voiceover commentary, as Winged Migration does? Do filmmakers use talking heads interviews with eyewitnesses and experts? And if they do they record these interviews in studios or offices, or do they go out on location and allow these people to freely move around the environment while they are talking about whatever it is the filmmaker wants them to talk about? How do they film the interviews? Do they go for a close-up? Do they go for a medium long shot? It might sound like a small difference, but it's the difference between whether or not viewers are paying attention to the participants' facial expressions, or if they are instead looking at the environment, the things around the person who is talking. And here's the thing about documentary. Fiction filmmaker can think about that thing ahead of time before the person starts talking. Documentarians have to anticipate and frankly guess as to which of these framings is going to be the best choice for that particular moment. And that's really where the magic often comes from. But this isn't the only way you can frame a documentary participant. You can also ask them to look directly at the camera, as Errol Morris does with Robert McNamara in The Fog of War. And it's a small difference between what you have here, where the participant is looking off to the side at the person standing next to the camera who is asking the questions. And here, where the filmmaker has asked the participant to look directly at the camera, it's a small, subtle difference, maybe 10 or 15 degrees, turning the head one way or the other, but it has an enormous impact on your emotional response to what the person is saying. In this case, Robert McNamara's regrets over his role in starting the Vietnam War. Do the filmmakers identify who the participants are with on-screen text? If they are speaking a foreign language, do the filmmakers dub or subtitle it, as Burns and Novick do when interviewing North Vietnamese veterans in the Vietnam War? Or do they leave the language untranslated, as Cloud Lanzmann does in his 9.5 hour Holocaust documentary Shoah? And having seen Shoah, I can say that a big part of the reason this film is 9.5 hours long is because when Cloud Lanzmann is interviewing these eyewitnesses about their experiences in the Holocaust, which in this man's case includes a very close brush with death, he is asking the question to his translator in French. The translator translates the French into Polish. Simon Strebenik answers the question in Polish, and then the translator translates that response back into French so Lanzmann can understand what he's been saying. And it adds a lot of time to every interview, and ultimately it does a lot to the film's already gargantuan runtime of 9.5 hours. But Lanzmann had to do it this way, he says, because to cut out what they were saying or add translations or to dub over it would fundamentally be disrespectful to what this man is saying. Do the filmmakers eschew entire talking heads entirely? Do they say we might get interviews, but we're only going to play the audio? We're not going to have those shots of people talking. We will instead show the audience archival footage. Two films that recently have taken this approach by Asif Kapadia are a documentary about the race car driver Richard Senna and another documentary which won the Oscar subsequently about Amy Winehouse. And both of these films take the participants' words, their memories of these people who are sadly no longer with us, and play them over archival footage of the subjects. So you have, in the case of Amy at least, this unbearable intimacy with the people who everybody is remembering in these films. Another choice the documentary filmmakers have to make: do you use archival footage at all? Do you use archival footage in combination with reenactments, as Errol Morris does in one of his most famous films, The Thin Blue Line? Do you appear as a filmmaker? Do you appear in the film itself? Do you do the Michael Moore or Sarah Polley approach of casting yourself as the lead character in your documentary, the guide to what viewers are going to be looking at and listening to and thinking about the entire time they're watching your movie? If you're making a true crime documentary, how do you tell the story? Do you simply tell the viewers the facts of the case, as in the Central Park Five or the recent OJ Made in America? Or do you take the facts and fashion them into a detective story with a mystery and a solution, a la The Thin Blue Line, which very famously actually got the outcome of this case, where Randall Dale Adams was wrongly accused of murder, actually got him off. It reopened the trial and he was cleared. If you're making a historical documentary, do you structure the film around a linear reconstruction of the facts, as Burns and Novick do in the Vietnam War, or do you organize the film around the participants' experiences, as Peter Davis does in his Oscar-winning film Hearts and Minds, an early protest documentary railing against the Vietnam War, which at that point was very much in the process of winding down? So this is what I'm talking about when I say that documentaries never reproduce the world, but they represent it. Filmmakers, even if their goal is to create an encounter with reality, to present a very truthful selection of the larger picture, even if objectivity is their goal, it is impossible to make a documentary without thinking about these decisions, and these decisions end up having a profound impact on what you, the viewer, take from the experience of watching the film. So that's a lot to absorb. So let's pause here and review some key elements of documentary style. Some things that filmmakers in this kind of movie think about when they're figuring out how to tell their stories. So when you're watching a documentary, any documentary, you should be looking out for these elements. Do you see voiceover narration or talking heads interviews? Do you see subtitles and dubbing over participants' experiences? Do you see archival footage? How is the narrative structure being set up? If any of these things are absent from the film, then why have the filmmakers opted not to use them? So, in short, ask yourself how documentary filmmakers are using the tools of documentary cinema to make an argument or tell a story about the world around them. These are the things that are going to come up over and over again, and you will see as you look through many documentaries that every filmmaker has a slightly different way of using or not using, as the case may be, these different elements. But here's the cool thing. These are not the only tools at documentarians' disposal. They also have all of the basic units of filmmaking that we discussed way back in the beginning of the semester: mise-en-scène, cinematography, acting, editing, and sound. Documentarians think about sets and props and costumes. They think about how to frame and light their shots. They think about when and when not to use music. They even think about things like casting and performance, as strange as that may seem. And if you don't believe me, just look at Grizzly Man. If you doubt the importance of mise-en-scène in documentary cinema, then take another look at how Herzog frames Timothy Treadwell's parents, who occupy maybe 3 or 4 minutes at most of this film. But just by talking to them in this environment, he conveys so much information to you, not just about who these people are, but also about the childhood that, in an inexplicable way that is impossible to truly understand, led Treadwell himself to live the life that he did in Alaska with the grizzly bears for 13 years. If you doubt the importance of music, then try to imagine Grizzly Man without Richard Thompson's beautiful soundtrack. This does so much to set your emotional relationship with Treadwell, a man you will never meet. But you are drawn into profound sympathy with him because this music is so beautiful, and it pulls you into the life of a character that you might otherwise not be inclined to like or to identify with or empathize with in any key way. And if you doubt the importance of performance, then my God, just try to imagine Grizzly Man without Timothy Treadwell. This man is an actor to his bones. Whether or not he is telling you the truth when he says that he almost won the role of Woody the bartender on Cheers, it doesn't matter. I mean, this man saw himself as a performance artist. He, the film's one of my favorite moments in the film is when you hear about how he fashioned this fake backstory for himself. It even she even included a not so great Australian accent because he wanted to invent himself as somebody different than who he was. And Herzog is very, very interested in this element of Grizzly Man. So, you're sitting here, you're listening to me talk about documentarians making creative choices, making storytelling decisions, making making real hard choices about mise en scène, cinematography, editing, and acting. And you're thinking, are we talking about documentary or have we started to shade over into fiction? And this is the beautiful thing about when you really analyze documentary as another genre of film. You you start talking about mise en scène and acting in documentaries, and the line between fiction and documentary starts to get really fuzzy really fast. And I'm not once again saying that documentaries are faking it. That would be too simplistic. But I am saying that most documentarians are ready to acknowledge that the line between what they do and what fiction does is quite thin because fundamentally what these two groups of filmmakers are both doing is telling stories. And their goals on some primal level, some fundamental level, are always to tell you a story that will hold your interest, stay with you, and in the best case scenarios, change how you think and act about the world around you. So, these questions about the fuzzy line between fiction and documentary are extremely important to Werner Herzog, the director of this week's film. Now, Herzog mostly keeps his body out of Grizzly Man, so it's hard to get a good look at him in the film itself. But I'm guessing that some of you probably heard the narrator and thought, wait a minute, that voice sounds familiar. Maybe you've seen Herzog play the villain in the surprisingly good Tom Cruise action movie Jack Reacher. Or if you're a Parks and Rec fan, you undoubtedly remember his memorable cameo in the final season premiere of that show, where he's like this crazy maintenance worker. And you can see Chris Pratt, sorry, was speaking for many of the episode's viewers when he's like, "Whoa, it's Werner Herzog." Or maybe if you're a Rick and Morty fan, you remember Herzog's memorable speech about the real purpose of human culture. Or if you're into Star Wars, you've probably seen Herzog play the mysterious client in the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian. And if you're one of the millions of people across the world who fell in love with Baby Yoda and found yourself posting or reposting Baby Yoda memes, you should send Herzog a thank you note. Because the story goes that the series writer-director, Jon Favreau, was planning to create Baby Yoda using CGI. But then Herzog called him a coward, like literally. He said that he only signed on to the series because he admired Favreau's commitment to practical filmmaking, to having real locations, real props, real actors, to not over rely on computers and things that weren't really there. And he said, how can you make a central component of your series this CGI bullshit? That is a betrayal of the commitment to material reality that your show embodies. And Favreau listened because Favreau knows that Herzog directed Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and Cobra Verde, among many, many other films that I'm going to tell you about in the next few slides. Which, I mean, these are just some of the great masterpieces of cinema. I mean, not to oversell them or anything, but like if you are looking for what can happen when a filmmaker really sticks to their guns and insists on doing it for real, you get some really amazing masterpieces. And Favreau knew that. But at the same time, you would have to forgive Favreau for not necessarily wanting to go as far as Herzog did in pursuing this vision. So, for example, when Herzog is making Aguirre, The Wrath of God, his film about Spanish conquistadors in the Amazon rainforest who stumble into the jungle with big heavy cannons and crazy armored suits and predictably starve to death and die. Herzog said it was not enough. It would not be convincing enough to simply get historical looking costumes to put a little dirt on their faces and say that they were like starving to death. No, he was after as close to the real thing as he could get. So he has his very small cast and crew basically live on wooden rafts like the one you're seeing in this picture for a period of several grueling weeks so that they could really have the real experience that their characters in the film were supposed to be having. When Herzog makes another film, Fitzcarraldo, a few years later, about this other German conqueror figure, this time in the present day, who is trying desperately to build an opera house in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. Just go with it. He says the only way I can truly capture what makes this character such a fascinating figure to me is to have this centerpiece of the film be the sequence where he's dragging this boat, this steamship, over a mountain. And Herzog, it was not enough, again, as always, to do this with models. He has literally spent months and months trying to figure out a way to actually drag a steamship over a mountain so that he could have his metaphor. Like, that's literally what he says. He needed his metaphor. But again, if you see the film, it's incredible. But the approach obviously did not endear him to his collaborators. Although, to be fair, this Herzog and Kinski, the actor in several of these films, were kind of at each other's throats like all the time. Even before Herzog said, "Hey, let's go to the jungle and starve to death." But nonetheless, it was a tough sell. It was a tough ask for people. But when you look at the films, you see how and why it mattered that Herzog did this to everybody. And so I'm going to show you a 2.5 minute clip from the end of Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and let you judge for yourselves.
When we reach the sea, we'll build a bigger boat. And with it, we'll sail north and take Trinidad away from the Spanish crown. From there, we'll go on and take Mexico from Cortez. What a great betrayal that will be. We will then control all of New Spain. And we will stage history as others stage plays. My own daughter, and with her found the purest dynasty ever known to man. this continent. Of the wrath of God. Who else is with me?
Now, these films really should come with a disclaimer to the effect of, do not try this at home. So, but nonetheless, as a cinephile, the part of me that is a cinephile is glad that Herzog made these movies this way. Because regardless of what his films are about, it ends up being the perfect approach for this theme that he ends up addressing in film after film after film of man versus the elements. And it ends up giving films like Fitzcarraldo or Aguirre, The Wrath of God, this hallucinatory quality, this desperate aura that ends up taking this really old and, at this point, frankly, cliched theme of man versus nature and making it feel meaningful again. With Fitzcarraldo, I mean, the point is that you were always aware, as Roger Ebert says, both of the film and of the making of the film. For Herzog, it was not enough to represent these conflicts, but to exempt himself from them because he knew that the audience would see through the lies. And so he subjects these collaborators in film after film after film to these arduous, torturous, frankly insane conditions. And here's the thing, people go along with it because they fundamentally realize that to do it any other way would be to sap these stories of their raw elemental power. So the great thing about Herzog is that these thematic interests of man versus nature and these unusual working methods are not confined to his fiction films. They are also deeply present in his documentaries, like Grizzly Man. Films like Lessons of Darkness, Into the Inferno, and Encounters at the End of the World find Herzog in extreme places and times, like Antarctica or on the side of a volcano. And if the fictional films like Aguirre and Fitzcarraldo have a charge of the real, then these documentaries explicitly introduce elements of fictionalization. Lessons of Darkness is way more poetic than factual. You do not learn much about what caused these fires, these oil fires in Kuwait after the Gulf War. You don't learn anything about that. What you get is Herzog showing you these striking and remarkable images of fire in the desert, and you hear him thinking about human existence from a really macro, grand, abstract perspective. The Wild Blue Yonder is on the image track footage, remarkable underwater footage. But the audio track and the way that Herzog puts this footage together tells you nothing about that. What it is in fact a science fiction film about aliens from outer space. And so he's radically recontextualizing this footage that is documentary footage of real places and times and presenting it to you as if it were science fiction. And then, of course, Encounters at the End of the World and Into the Inferno are not giving you a neat little narrative about penguins or about how volcanoes are formed, but they are giving you stories about the people on the edges of society who are invested in spending all of their time in the coldest, most remote place in the world, or who want to like put themselves into these murderously hot volcanoes day after day after day. And Herzog's interest in documentary and fiction and blurring these two modes and using the toolkit from from both of these forms of cinema to explore the same sets of issues probably reaches its culmination in the fact that in a 10-year space of time, he decides that he needs to effectively make the same movie, tell the same story about this German American pilot who was shot down in Vietnam and spent several years in a North Vietnamese prison camp before he finally escaped. Herzog decided that he had to do it first as a documentary, where he asked Little Dieter, the man pictured in the title, to return to the locations where he had been in prison 20, 30 years before and reenact some of the critical episodes that took place there. So basically turning Dieter into an actor, but an actor who is reenacting his own experiences. But Herzog said, that's not enough. And 10 years later, he takes that story and makes it again as a fiction film called Rescue Dawn, where Christian Bale is starring as Little Dieter. And just as he asked the actual person to become an actor and reenact these events, he subjects Christian Bale and Steve Zahn to the same crazy conditions that Klaus Kinski had endured 20 years in the past. And so when you watch Rescue Dawn, you really see Christian Bale's already remarkable fixation with transforming his body with each and every film that he makes, being pushed to its zenith by Werner Herzog. You almost get the sense that Herzog's like, oh, you think it was tough to get really buff for Batman and then lose all of that weight for The Machinist? Well, son, it's about to get real. So why does Herzog do all of this? Why does he take fiction and documentary and blur them together? Why does he inject elements of documentary truth into his fiction films? And why does he fictionalize things that he could just as easily, quote unquote, present straight? Well, I'll let Herzog answer these questions for himself. He writes in one interview, or writes in one book, quote, "There are deeper strata of truth in cinema, and there is such a thing as poetic, ecstatic truth. It is mysterious and elusive, and can be reached only through fabrication and imagination and stylization." End quote. This next quote is one of the best things I've ever heard a filmmaker say. Quote, "We are into the illumination for the sake of a deeper truth, for an ecstasy of truth, for something we can experience in great literature and cinema. If you're purely after facts, please buy yourself the phone directory of Manhattan. It has 4 million correct facts." And what Herzog is after in these quotes and in these statements is that he just simply does not see any distinction between documentary and fiction. He sees reality and narrative as two tools that any filmmaker must use in order to get at that shared objective of telling a good story that has something meaningful to say to the people who made it and the people who watch it about the world they both inhabit. And he's just, whether you agree necessarily with some of the specific choices he makes in these films, or whether you see him as a model for the kinds of films you may wish to make or work on, which you probably shouldn't do that just because it's really unsafe for everybody. But regardless of all of that, you have to respect that we have such a great and talented filmmaker who is challenging us to think about these questions, because if nothing else, they force you to get outside of the very narrow paradigm of documentary storytelling that you get if you just limit yourself to what you see in school or what you see on TV or on Netflix. So you see all of this coming together in Grizzly Man. And even though the title and premise suggest a very straightforward nature documentary or a trashy expose, the film is exceptionally complex, and Herzog's unique approach to synthesizing documentary and fiction is something that allows the film to really transcend itself and to really get at something much more interesting than what you would necessarily expect to get just based on the title and the premise. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the final part of this lecture. So, what Herzog is doing in Grizzly Man, if you break it down, is he is blending and synthesizing at least three different documentary traditions, which are described in more depth in the Bill Nichols reading that accompanies this week's lecture. So let's break this down. Expository documentaries. These are the documentaries that make rhetorical arguments, that emphasize the impression of objectivity, and that are frequently using images, either talking heads interviews or archival footage or reenactments, to illustrate what the voiceover narration says. Again, an argumentative form of documentary. These are your Planet Earths, your Ken Burns films. These are the things that 9 times out of 10, when you watch a movie in school for science class or social studies or anything else, you're watching something like this. And this is, generally speaking, the thing that Grizzly Man tries to avoid being. But there are elements of this mode of documentary filmmaking, the expository mode, in Grizzly Man, because look at who is paying for this thing. The Discovery Channel. The Discovery Channel is one of the two organizations, along with Lionsgate Films, that is paying for Grizzly Man. And they are attaching a few conditions, whether these are explicitly stated or not. One of the expectations that they have for Herzog, and that Herzog knows that they have, is that you're going to get a certain amount of straightforward information about grizzly bears. And one of the reasons the film works is because you get a lot of attention being devoted to this fundamental question of whether or not Treadwell was doing the right thing by spending so much time living with these grizzly bears. And you get another feature of the expository mode. You get these talking heads who come on and give you their take on what Treadwell was doing and what Herzog is doing. And in the process of listening to these experts talk about grizzly bears and conservation efforts surrounding the effort to keep them alive and healthy, you learn a lot about how we should go about holding on to the wonders of the natural world. So you do get a lot of expository mode stuff in Grizzly Man. But you also get elements of the second documentary tradition, the participatory tradition. These are the documentaries that often are trying to do a fly on the wall thing. They're trying to record spontaneous lived experiences. They're frequently emphasizing the documentarians' interactions with their participants and their participants' interactions with each other. And directly or indirectly, these films are exploring how cameras affect the way that people behave. This is where you get your Michael Moores of the world. Films like Bowling for Columbine, where Michael Moore is literally walking around, traveling around the United States, talking with pro and anti gun control supporters. And he's your guide to the film. And one of the points of watching the film is to watch Michael Moore raise hell. But you're also getting films like the Maisel brothers films about the Rolling Stones, Gimme Shelter, which is framing all of the concert footage by these really remarkable scenes in the editing room where the Maisels are showing the Rolling Stones an early cut of the film that we are subsequently watching and then recording their reactions to it. And so you get a real explicit commentary on how documentary filmmakers are helping to construct and deconstruct the star image that the Rolling Stones are cultivating much more straightforwardly in their concert appearances. Really amazing films. This is sometimes called cinema verite or direct cinema. These are other terms that you may have heard for this kind of filmmaking. And this is really how you get, as I said, the fly on the wall approach that somebody like Frederick Wiseman, who started making films in the 1960s and is still making them today, actually. This whole approach in films like High School or National Gallery or In Jackson Heights is to pretend that the filmmaker is not there, to create the illusion that we are watching life as is really lived if a fly, as I said, were buzzing around or if it's as if no one was there. And these are incredible films. You should check them out. They're all available on Canopy. You can see many Frederick Wiseman films very easily. But here's the thing. As good as they are kind of founded on a premise that is a little bit bullshit. This is very much Herzog's perspective, although he is, in all honesty, much angrier about it than I am. But he says, by dint of declaration, the so-called cinema verite is devoid of verite. It reaches a merely superficial truth, the truth of accountants. Cinema verite confounds fact and truth, and thus plows only stones. And yet facts sometimes have a strange and bizarre power that makes their inherent truth seem unbelievable. End quote. And then a little later in this manifesto that he writes about why he will never be a cinema verite filmmaker like Frederick Wiseman, he says, these filmmakers resemble tourists who take pictures amid ancient ruins of facts. And so fundamentally what Herzog is saying is that he thinks that this approach is not possible, one, and two, wouldn't really tell you very much that was interesting, even if it was possible. He is very much looking at films by Frederick Wiseman and saying, like, what truth are you really revealing by going into these places and trying to act like your presence as a filmmaker holding a camera isn't fundamentally changing how these people are acting first and foremost, and why are you thinking secondly that like this is going to give us anything more than just the surface reality. So you see this approach throughout Herzog's films, particularly in some of the best moments in Grizzly Man. This scene, which you will undoubtedly never forget after seeing it, is the one at the center of the film, the literal center of the film, where Herzog is playing the fabled tape that contains the last documentary record of Timothy Treadwell's final moments. And Herzog has talked about how there was a certain amount of commercial pressure to include this footage in the film, to somehow structure the film around the revelation of this audio of Timothy Treadwell's death. And Herzog said, I cannot do this. This would be obscene and voyeuristic. So what he did instead was he uses this as the basis of a really powerful interaction between him and Timothy Treadwell's ex-girlfriend, where he plays the tape and his back is turned to us, and we are focused very closely on her reactions as she watches Herzog listen to this tape that she has never listened to. And it becomes the real focus of the scene is not on the voyeuristic sort of grisly details of this man's horrible death. It's on the impact his life had on the people who are still here to remember him. You also see the same emphasis that is characteristic of the participatory mode in the interactions between the filmmaker and some of the other participants in the documentary. So the scene with the coroner, of course, you should study that scene closely because this guy missed his calling. This guy really should have been the actor that Timothy Treadwell claims he wanted to be, because his performance of his hypothetical imagining of the final moments of between Treadwell and his girlfriend and the grizzly bears is a one man like show. And Herzog just basically gives this guy the space to perform this remarkable monologue that is just by the end of it, you're not even thinking about the things that he's talking about. You just can't take your eyes off this guy. So again, this is something that's very characteristic of the participatory mode. If he was just after who Timothy Treadwell was and how did he die, he would have cut this stuff out of the film because it detracts from what the movie seems to be about. But Herzog is smarter than that, and he knows that what the film is really about is these extreme personalities and these extreme states of being. And so he leaves this in because even though it detracts from the argument about Timothy Treadwell and whether he was a good guy or a bad guy or a crazy guy or a misunderstood guy, he leaves it in because it speaks to these questions on a deeper level. And you really see the participatory mode come out when Herzog is explicitly commenting on the archival footage of Treadwell that is taking up about 80% of the film. And the film, at its very best, is really a dialogue between these two filmmakers. Herzog never met Treadwell, never had a conversation with him. But in the process of contrasting his footage with Treadwell's footage and talking over some of the shots from Treadwell's footage that he includes in the film and telling you how he responds to them and how he thinks about them, Herzog is really taking something that could have been a very straightforward nature doc or a trashy, sleazy expose and is using it as the basis of an imaginary conversation between two filmmakers about the proper and most effective way to capture the truth of human experience, or at least of this human experience. And this leads to the last spin that Herzog has for traditional documentary traditions, which is the poetic mode. And these are documentaries that stress moods and tones and emotions and impressions much more than they stress facts. And they will often take a modernist or even a postmodernist approach to the whole idea that reality is inaccessible and fragmented and incoherent, that we can't necessarily know everything that we may want to know about something. And in the process of going for the moods and the tones and a fragmentary vision of reality, these documentaries often take on a very self-reflexive bent, and you start seeing the documentarian spend more and more energy as the film goes on thinking about how the film is representing reality itself. So this is where you get things like Alan Rene's 1955 Holocaust documentary Night and Fog, which is using the premise of a historical fact-based documentary to actually explore the complex and very, very confused process of cultural memory that was going on in France around this time, where like nobody really wanted to totally admit that that was something that had just happened. Or you get things like Godfrey Reggio's Koyaanisqatsi, which is ostensibly a nature documentary, but really what it's doing is taking this footage of nature and modern cities and speeding it up and slowing it down, superimposing this, that, and the other thing on top of each other. And by the time the film ends, what you have gotten is not something that has taught you anything about nature or the cities, but has instead been this epic poem about where human beings like are in the grand scheme of things, universally speaking. So you see this mode come out really strongly in Grizzly Man when Herzog is showing Treadwell, for example, film the same scenes up to 15 times because he's trying to style himself as this rugged individualist who lives among the bears without other people. And some of the best moments in the film are the ones where Herzog is explicitly showing you how much Herzog had to cut out or not even film at all in order to preserve the story that he was trying to tell through video, which you have these remarkable scenes where Herzog is saying, you know, we looked and we looked and we looked for evidence of his girlfriend his girlfriend Amy, who was there with him and who died alongside him, but we couldn't find it. There's 100 hours of video footage, and we found maybe about 2 minutes total showing her. Her family didn't want to participate, so we couldn't get their perspectives on what she meant to Treadwell and why she was out there in the first place. And these are really wonderful moments because they call so much attention to something that is honestly true of most documentaries, if not all documentaries. These cuts and these decisions about what to film at all, what to train your camera on, what to omit from the frame, what to cut out of the movie after you've maybe filmed some footage of it. These are decisions that every documentarian is making. It's not like Treadwell is the only guy doing this. This is something Herzog is also doing and other documentarians are doing. The only thing that's really different about Herzog's approach is that he is openly underlining this fact rather than trying to hide from it. And the last real strong moment or series of moments that are from the poetic mode of documentaries are the numerous moments throughout the film where Herzog just puts up something that Treadwell has filmed and says, "What a beautiful shot!" Like what a beautiful, beautiful shot. And he is really marveling at, for example, this moment where Treadwell has, in between takes, walked out of frame, and you get this beautiful looking, wonderfully composed shot of the wind blowing through the trees. And these are the moments where it's arguable that Herzog is at his most sympathetic to Treadwell. So, a really wonderful film. Stay tuned for a follow-up video where I talk more about the film with my good friend Zach Powell, who is a theorist and scholar of documentary cinema. And he's got a really interesting perspective on this film. So stay tuned for that. While you are watching this movie or that conversation about the film that I will be posting shortly, or this lecture, you should be thinking about some of these questions. All right. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. I will catch you next time.